Maggie Collins stood in her small kitchen, holding the white envelope that had arrived 3 days ago. She had read the letter inside at least 10 times, but it still felt strange. The fancy law office wanted her to come for the reading of Mr. Harold Whitman's will. She had worked as his housekeeper for 15 years, cleaning his big house and helping him with daily tasks. Now he was gone, and somehow she was invited to this important meeting. She looked at herself in the hallway mirror and smoothed down her navy blue dress. It was her best dress, the one she wore to church on Sundays. Her shoes were old but clean, and she carried the small black purse her mother had given her years ago. Maggie felt nervous about going to such a fancy place, but the letter said she had to be there. The law offices of Peterson and Associates sat in the tallest building downtown. Maggie had never been inside such an expensive place. The floors were shiny marble and huge paintings hung on the walls. The secretary behind the desk wore a suit that probably cost more than Maggie made in a month. She told Maggie to wait in the conference room down the hall. As Maggie walked toward the room, she heard voices and laughter coming from inside. She paused at the doorway and saw people she recognized from the photos in Mr. Harold's house. These were his family members, the ones who rarely visited him except when they needed money. Richard Whitman sat at the head of the long table like he owned the place. He was Harold's son, a man in his 50s with gray hair and an expensive suit. His wife Linda sat next to him, wearing jewelry that sparkled under the bright lights. She was talking loudly about their plans to buy a new car after today's meeting. Across from them sat Patricia Kent, Harold's daughter. She looked like she spent a lot of money on her appearance. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her red dress looked like it came from the most expensive store in town. Her husband Stephen nodded along as she talked about the vacation they would take once they got their inheritance. Harold's younger brother Frank sat quietly in the corner. Even though he was retired from his job at the bank, he still dressed like he was going to work every day. His adult children, Carl and Susan, sat on either side of him. Carl kept checking his expensive watch, and Susan was looking at something on her phone. When Maggie stepped into the room, all conversation stopped. Everyone turned to look at her, and she felt her cheeks turn red. She had hoped to sit quietly in the back, but now all eyes were on her. "Well, well," Richard said with a smirk. "Look who decided to join the family meeting." Linda giggled behind her hand. "I wondered why the maid was here. Maybe she thinks she's getting something." Patricia looked Maggie up and down like she was judging her. "Daddy always was too soft with the help. I told him he paid you too much for just cleaning and cooking." Maggie wanted to say that she did much more than clean and cook. She had taken care of Mr. Harold when he was sick. She had listened to his stories about the old days. She had made sure he took his medicine and ate his meals. When he was lonely, she had sat with him and watched his favorite shows. But she kept quiet and found an empty chair in the back of the room. "I can't imagine why she needs to be here," Stephen said to his wife, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is family business." Carl laughed. "Maybe Uncle Harold left her his old coffee maker. She always was making him coffee. Or his collection of old books," Susan added. "Though I doubt she can even read them." The family laughed at their own jokes, and Maggie felt smaller and smaller in her chair. She had never asked Mr. Harold for anything extra. She had just done her job and tried to be kind to him. He had been lonely after his wife died, and Maggie had tried to make his days a little brighter. Frank cleared his throat. "Now, children, let's not be rude. Margaret has been with Harold for many years." But Richard waved his hand. "Come on, Uncle Frank, we all know why she's here. Dad probably left her a small thank you gift, maybe a few $100s or some old furniture." "That would be generous," Patricia said. 15 years of dusting doesn't exactly qualify someone for a real inheritance." Linda nodded in agreement. "Some people get ideas above their station. They think just because they work for a rich family, they deserve more than their paycheck." Maggie stared at her hands in her lap. She remembered all the times these people had visited Mr. Harold's house. Richard always came when his business was in trouble and he needed money. Patricia visited when she wanted her father to pay for something expensive. None of them ever stayed long, and they never seemed happy to see their father. They talked to him like he was just a source of money. She remembered how sad Mr. Harold looked after they left. He would sit in his favorite chair and stare out the window. Sometimes he would tell Maggie that his children were too busy for him. He said he understood, but she could see the hurt in his eyes. The door opened, and a tall man in a dark suit walked in. This was Mr. Peterson, the lawyer. He carried a thick folder and looked very serious. Behind him came two other people who worked at the law office. "Good afternoon, everyone," Mr. Peterson said as he sat down at the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming today. I know this is a difficult time for the family." He opened his folder and pulled out several papers. "Before we begin, I want to make sure everyone who was named in Mr. Whitman's will is present. This is required by law." Richard looked around the room and his eyes stopped on Maggie. "I still don't understand why she needs to be here. This is a private family matter." Mr. Peterson looked at Richard over his glasses. "Mrs. Collins was specifically named in your father's will, Mr. Whitman. She has every right to be here." The family members looked at each other with surprise. They had assumed Maggie would get something small, but being specifically named in the will sounded more important than they had expected. Patricia leaned over to her husband and whispered something that made him nod. Carl looked at his sister, Susan, and raised his eyebrows. Linda grabbed Richard's arm and squeezed it. Mr. Peterson spread the papers out in front of him. "Your father left very specific instructions about how this meeting should be conducted. Everyone must remain seated until I have finished reading the entire will. No interruptions will be allowed." He looked around the room at each person. Harold Whitman was a very wealthy man. His estate includes his construction company, several properties, investments, and personal belongings. The total value is approximately $12 million. The family members sat up straighter in their chairs. $12 million was more than some of them had expected. They began to smile and nod at each other, already thinking about how they would spend their inheritance. Maggie sat quietly in the back, feeling more out of place than ever. $12 million was more money than she could even imagine. She made $25,000 a year working for Mr. Harold, and she had thought that was good money. Now she understood why his family was so interested in this meeting. Peterson cleared his throat and picked up the first page of the will. "Now, let us begin with Harold Whitman's final wishes." Mr. Peterson adjusted his glasses and began reading from the thick document in front of him. His voice was clear and formal as he read the opening words of Harold Whitman's last will and testament. The family members leaned forward in their chairs, eager to hear their names and the amounts they would inherit. "I, Harold James Whitman, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament," the lawyer read. "I revoke all previous wills and codicils made by me." Richard nodded approvingly and whispered to his wife Linda, "Finally, we'll see what the old man really thought of us." Linda squeezed his hand and smiled. She was already thinking about the new house they could buy with Richard's inheritance. Patricia smoothed her dress and sat up straighter. She had been waiting for this day for years. Her father had always been tight with his money while he was alive, but now she would finally get what she deserved as his daughter. She thought about the expensive jewelry she had seen in magazines and the fancy vacation she wanted to take to Europe. Mr. Peterson continued reading the legal language that explained how the will was made and witnessed. The family members grew restless during this boring part. They wanted to hear about the money and properties. Carl kept tapping his fingers on the table, and Susan checked her phone again. "Now we come to the distribution of personal effects and smaller bequests," Mr. Peterson announced. This caught everyone's attention. Even the smaller gifts from a rich man like Harold would be worth good money. The family straightened up and listened carefully. "To the Riverside Community Center I leave my collection of woodworking tools to be used in their workshop programs for young people." Richard rolled his eyes. "Dad and his charity projects, always giving money to strangers instead of family. To St. Mary's Church, where my dear wife Helen is buried. I leave the sum of $5,000 for the maintenance of the cemetery grounds." Patricia sighed loudly. "More money going to charity. I hope he didn't give away too much to these places." Mr. Peterson looked up from the papers with a stern expression. "Please remember that I asked for no interruptions until I finish reading the entire will." But the family ignored his request. They were too excited and impatient to stay quiet. Frank tried to shush his children, but they were adults and didn't listen to him anymore. As the lawyer continued with more small gifts to charities and organizations, Richard grew bolder with his comments. "I bet the maid over there is hoping to get something," he said, pointing at Maggie. "What do you think, Margaret? Maybe you'll get his old apron from when he tried to cook for himself." Linda laughed out loud. "Oh, Richard, you're terrible, but maybe she will get his reading glasses. She could use them to read the want ads when she looks for a new job." Maggie felt her face turn red with embarrassment. She had never asked Mr. Harold for anything beyond her regular pay. She had hoped that maybe he would leave her a small amount of money, enough to help her when she got older and couldn't work anymore. But she certainly didn't expect anything big. Patricia joined in the cruel jokes. Maybe Daddy left her his collection of old magazines. She always liked to look at the pictures when she was supposed to be working. This wasn't true, and Maggie wanted to defend herself. She had only looked at Mr. Harold's magazines when he asked her to read articles to him when his eyes got tired. But she stayed quiet because she didn't want to cause trouble. Stephen, Patricia's husband, decided to add his own comment. "Some people think that just because they dust the furniture and make the beds, they become part of the family. But there's a big difference between working for someone and actually being related to them." Carl nodded in agreement. "Exactly. The help should know their place. Just because Uncle Harold was kind to her doesn't mean she deserves any real money." Susan looked directly at Maggie when she spoke. "I heard that some maids and housekeepers try to take advantage of old people. They act all sweet and caring, but really they're just trying to get into the will." Maggie's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. She had genuinely cared about Mr. Harold. When he was sick with the flu last winter, she had stayed late to make him soup and tea. When he felt sad about missing his wife, she had listened to his stories about their 50 years of marriage. She had never done these things to get money. She had done them because she liked Mr. Harold and wanted him to be happy. Frank looked uncomfortable with his family's behavior. "Now, children, that's enough. Margaret has always been respectful and hardworking." But Richard ignored his uncle. "Come on, Uncle Frank. We all know how this works. Dad probably felt sorry for her and left her a few $1,000s. Maybe enough to buy a used car or pay off some bills. That's generous enough for someone who just cleaned house." Mr. Peterson was getting annoyed with the interruptions, but he continued reading the smaller bequests. There were gifts to Harold's doctor, his accountant, and several other people who had helped him over the years. Each time a gift was mentioned, the family made comments about how their father was giving away their inheritance to outsiders. "To my gardener, Miguel Santos, who kept my wife's rose garden beautiful for 20 years, I leave the sum of $10,000, Mr. Peterson read. $10,000 to the gardener, Patricia exclaimed. That's ridiculous. He just cut grass and planted flowers. And what about us? Richard demanded. We're his children. We should come first. Linda was calculating in her head how much money was being given away. At this rate, there won't be anything left for the real family. Maggie thought about Miguel, the quiet man who had worked in Mr. Harold's garden. He had a wife and 3 children, and he worked very hard to keep the yard looking perfect. $10,000 would help his family a lot. She was happy that Mr. Harold had remembered him. The lawyer continued with more bequests to various people and organizations. With each one, the family grew more upset and more vocal in their complaints. They acted like every dollar given to someone else was stolen from them. To my neighbor, Mrs. Dorothy Kim, who brought me homemade cookies every Christmas and checked on me when I was ill, I leave the sum of $3,000. Carl shook his head in disgust. $3,000 for cookies? I could have brought him cookies if I knew he was paying for them. But Maggie remembered Mrs. Kim. She was a widow who lived alone and didn't have much money. She had brought cookies to Mr. Harold, not because she wanted something, but because she was kind. The $3,000 was Mr. Harold's way of thanking her for caring about him. As the list of smaller bequests continued, the family's mockery turned more toward Maggie. They seemed to think that making fun of her would somehow make their own inheritance bigger. I wonder what skills Margaret will put on her resume, Richard said with a mean smile. 15 years of experience in dusting and laundry folding. Don't forget making coffee, Linda added. That's very important experience. Patricia pretended to be helpful. Maybe she can get a job with another rich family, though she's getting older now. Most people want younger maids. Stephen nodded seriously as if he was giving real advice. She should be grateful for the steady work she's had. Not everyone is lucky enough to work for a generous man like Harold. The family continued their cruel comments, each one trying to be funnier than the last. They talked about Maggie like she wasn't even in the room, or like she couldn't understand what they were saying. They made jokes about her clothes, her age, her education, and her future prospects. Maggie sat quietly through all of this, feeling smaller with each comment. She wondered if she should just leave. Maybe she didn't belong here after all. These people were rich and educated and sophisticated. She was just a simple woman who had cleaned their father's house and tried to make his life a little easier, but something kept her in her seat. Maybe it was curiosity about what Mr. Harold had left her, or maybe it was stubbornness. She had been invited here, and the lawyer had said she had a right to be present, so she would stay until the end, no matter how uncomfortable these people made her feel. Mr. Peterson finally finished reading the smaller bequests and looked up at the room. Now we come to the main provisions of the will, concerning the distribution of Harold Whitman's primary estate. The family immediately stopped talking and focused all their attention on the lawyer. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The jokes and mockery were forgotten as they prepared to hear about the millions of dollars that would soon be theirs. Richard straightened his tie and smiled. Patricia smoothed her hair and sat up tall. Linda grabbed her husband's hand and Carl and Susan exchanged excited glances. Even Frank leaned forward with interest. In the back of the room, Maggie held her breath and waited to hear what would happen next. The room became completely silent as Mr. Peterson turned to a new page in Harold's will. Everyone held their breath, waiting to hear their names and the amounts they would inherit. Richard sat up straight in his chair, already imagining how he would spend his millions. Patricia smoothed her dress one more time and prepared to look surprised and grateful when her name was called. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat and began to read in his clear professional voice. I now come to the distribution of my primary estate, including all properties, business interests, and remaining financial assets. Linda squeezed Richard's hand under the table. This was it. After years of waiting, they would finally get what they deserved as Harold's family. Carl and Susan looked at each other with excitement, while Frank nodded approvingly, expecting his brother to take care of the family properly. To my son, Richard James Whitman, Mr. Peterson read slowly and clearly. Richard leaned forward with a big smile on his face. He was ready to hear a number in the millions. As the oldest child and only son, he expected to get the biggest share of his father's fortune. I leave the sum of $1. The smile disappeared from Richard's face instantly. He blinked several times as if he hadn't heard correctly. I'm sorry, what did you say? Mr. Peterson repeated the words without emotion. To my son, Richard James Whitman, I leave the sum of $1. Richard's face turned bright red. That's impossible. There must be a mistake. Read it again. But the lawyer continued reading Harold's explanation. I leave Richard this amount because I have already given him more than enough money during my lifetime. Over the past 20 years, I have paid for his failed business ventures, covered his debts, and supported his expensive lifestyle. I have given him over $2 million, which he has wasted through poor decisions and careless spending. He has never shown gratitude for my help or respect for the hard work it took to earn this money. Richard jumped up from his chair, his face now purple with anger. This is crazy. My father wasn't thinking straight. No father would do this to his own son. Linda grabbed her husband's arm, trying to pull him back down. She looked like she might faint. All their plans for a new house and expensive cars were disappearing before their eyes. Mr. Peterson ignored the outburst and continued reading. To my daughter Patricia Helen Kent, I leave the sum of $1. Patricia's mouth fell open in shock. She had been so confident about her inheritance that she couldn't understand what was happening. There has to be some mistake, she whispered. The lawyer read Harold's explanation for his daughter. I leave Patricia this amount because she has made it clear through her actions and words that she values my money more than our relationship. She visits me only when she needs financial help. She has never shown interest in my life, my health, or my happiness. When she does visit, she spends the time talking about expensive things she wants to buy and places she wants to travel. She has treated my employees, especially Margaret Collins, with rudeness and disrespect. Patricia began to cry, but they were tears of anger, not sadness. How dare he write such things about me? I loved my father. Stephen put his arm around his wife, but he looked shocked too. They had already made plans to use Patricia's inheritance to start their own business. Now those dreams were crushed. Mr. Peterson continued with the same calm voice. To my brother, Frank Robert Whitman, I leave the sum of $1. Frank had been trying to stay calm during his nephew and niece's outbursts, but now his face went pale. He had expected his brother to remember him generously in the will. I leave Frank this amount because, although he is a good man, he has never needed my help. He made his own fortune working at the bank and has always been financially secure. However, he failed to teach his children the values of hard work and respect that our parents taught us. The lawyer turned to Carl and Susan. To my nephew, Carl William Whitman, I leave the sum of $1. To my niece, Susan Marie Whitman, I leave the sum of $1. Both of them started protesting at the same time. Carl stood up and pointed at the papers. This is insane. Uncle Harold was old and confused. No one in their right mind would give away millions to strangers. Susan was crying now too. We're his family. We have rights. This isn't fair. Mr. Peterson read Harold's explanation for his nephew and niece. I leave Carl and Susan these amounts because they have shown themselves to be greedy and entitled. They expect money from me simply because we share blood, but they have never earned it through kindness or effort. They have been rude to my employees and have made it clear that they see me only as a source of money. The room erupted in chaos. Everyone was shouting at once. Richard demanded to see the original will. Patricia screamed that her father must have been tricked by someone. Frank tried to restore order, but his own children were too upset to listen. Linda was crying into her hands, and Stephen was shaking his head in disbelief. Through all the noise and confusion, Maggie sat quietly in the back of the room. She felt sorry for the family's pain even though they had been cruel to her. She also felt confused. If Harold had left almost nothing to his own family, what did that mean for her? Mr. Peterson raised his voice to speak over the shouting. Please, everyone, return to your seats. I am not finished reading the will. Richard was pacing back and forth behind his chair. There's nothing left to read. The old man has lost his mind and given everything away to charity. Actually, Mr. Peterson said, looking directly at Richard, your father was very specific about the main beneficiary of his estate. The room became quiet again. Everyone looked at the lawyer with hope and fear. Maybe Harold had saved the real inheritance for last. Maybe this was all some kind of test or joke. Mr. Peterson turned to a new page and found the section he was looking for. To Margaret Collins, who has worked in my household for 15 years, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate. The silence that followed was so complete that Maggie could hear her own heartbeat. She was sure she had misunderstood. The lawyer must have said something else. I'm sorry, she said in a small voice. Could you repeat that? Mr. Peterson looked directly at her and spoke slowly and clearly. To Margaret Collins, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate, including all properties, business interests, bank accounts, investments, and personal belongings. This includes my construction company, my house and vacation home, all stocks and bonds, and all other assets not previously mentioned in this will. Maggie felt like the room was spinning around her. This couldn't be real. She was just a housekeeper. She cleaned floors and made beds and cooked simple meals. Rich people didn't leave their fortunes to people like her. The lawyer continued reading Harold's explanation. Margaret has shown me more genuine kindness and respect in 15 years than my own family has shown me in 75 years. She cared for me when I was sick, listened to my stories when I was lonely, and treated me like a human being rather than just a source of money. She never asked me for anything beyond her salary, and she often tried to do extra things to make my life more comfortable. Richard was staring at Maggie with a look of pure hatred. This is impossible. She's nobody. She's just a cleaning woman. Patricia was screaming now. She tricked him. She poisoned his mind against his own family. This has to be illegal. Mr. Peterson continued reading Harold's words. Margaret never hinted that she wanted more money or gifts. When I mentioned changing my will, she actually tried to talk me out of it, saying that I should leave everything to my family. Her honest reaction convinced me that she was the right person to inherit my life's work. The lawyer looked up from the papers and spoke to the room. The total value of the estate left to Margaret Collins is approximately $12 million. Carl fell back into his chair as if he had been hit. Susan was crying so hard she could barely breathe. Frank sat in stunned silence, trying to understand how his brother could have made such a decision. Maggie couldn't move or speak. $12 million was more money than she could even imagine. She had never dreamed of being rich. She had only wanted to do her job well and treat Mr. Harold with kindness. Richard turned to face her, his eyes blazing with anger. You won't. Get away with this. We'll fight this will. We'll prove that you manipulated a sick old man. Patricia pointed her finger at Maggie. You planned this. You probably gave him drugs to make him confused. You stole our inheritance. But Mr. Peterson held up his hand for silence. Before anyone makes accusations or threats, you should know that Harold anticipated this reaction. He took several steps to ensure that his will could not be successfully challenged. The lawyer opened another folder and pulled out more documents. Your father underwent psychiatric evaluation just 2 months before his death. The doctor confirmed that he was completely mentally competent. Harold also made video recordings explaining his decisions, and he had multiple witnesses to the signing of this will. He looked around the room at each family member. Furthermore, Harold kept detailed records of his interactions with all of you over the past 5 years. He documented every request for money, every rude comment made to his employees, and every visit that lasted less than an hour because you were too busy to spend time with him. The family fell silent as the full impact of the situation hit them. The family's angry shouts filled the conference room as Mr. Peterson reached for another thick folder on his desk. Richard was still pacing behind his chair, his face red with fury. Patricia had stopped crying and was now glaring at Maggie with pure hatred. The others sat in shocked silence, trying to understand how their lives had changed so completely in just a few minutes. There's more, Mr. Peterson announced, his voice cutting through the noise. Harold left specific instructions for me to share additional information after reading the will. Richard spun around to face the lawyer. More? What else could there possibly be? He's already given away our entire inheritance to a stranger. Mr. Peterson pulled out a sealed envelope and opened it carefully. Your father wrote a personal letter to be read aloud at this meeting. He wanted you to understand exactly why he made these decisions. Linda wiped her eyes and looked up hopefully. Maybe he explains how to reverse this. Maybe he left instructions for getting our money back. The lawyer unfolded several handwritten pages. Harold's careful writing covered every line. This letter is dated 3 months before your father's death, and it was witnessed by 3 people, including his doctor. Frank leaned forward in his chair. Just read it, Peterson. We need to know what Harold was thinking. Mr. Peterson began reading Harold's own words. My dear family, if you are hearing this letter, then I am gone and you have just learned about my will. I know you are angry and confused. You probably think I was not thinking clearly when I made these decisions. But I want you to know that I planned everything very carefully. Patricia interrupted with a bitter laugh. Carefully? He call, giving $12 million to the maid, careful planning. The lawyer continued reading despite the interruption. I have been watching all of you for the past 5 years, ever since your mother died. I kept detailed notes about our conversations and your behavior. I also recorded many of our phone calls and visits, which was legal to do in my own home. Carl's eyes widened with surprise. He recorded us? Without telling us? I did this because I wanted to make sure I understood your true feelings about me and about money. Mr. Peterson read from Harold's letter. What I discovered made me very sad, but it also made my final decision much easier. The lawyer turned to a new page. Richard, in the past 5 years you visited me 37 times. 29 of those visits were to ask for money. The longest visit that wasn't about money lasted only 45 minutes. And that was because your car broke down and you were waiting for a repair truck. Richard's face turned even redder. That's not true. I visited Dad all the time. Mr. Peterson continued reading Harold's exact words. During your last visit, Richard, you spent 20 minutes telling me about your money problems and only 5 minutes asking about my health. When I told you about my chest pains, you said, "That's nice, Dad," because you weren't really listening. You were thinking about how to ask me for $50,000. Linda grabbed her husband's arm. She remembered that visit. Richard had practiced his speech about needing money during the entire car ride to his father's house. The lawyer turned to Patricia's section of the letter. Patricia, you visited me even less than your brother. In 5 years, you came to see me only 19 times. 15 of those visits were to ask for money or to hint that you needed help paying for something expensive. Patricia started to protest, but Mr. Peterson kept reading. I have a recording of your phone call from last Christmas, Patricia. You called to thank me for the $5,000 check I sent you. During that call, you spent 12 minutes talking about the expensive vacation you wanted to take, and you spent less than 2 minutes asking how I was feeling or what I did for the holiday. Tears started running down Patricia's face again, but this time they seemed different. Maybe she was starting to remember how those conversations really went. Harold's letter continued with more painful details about each family member. He wrote about Carl asking to borrow money for a new car, then not calling for 3 months. He described Susan visiting only when she needed help with her credit card bills. He wrote about Frank giving advice about investing money but never asking about Harold's loneliness or health. But the worst part, Mr. Peterson read, was how all of you treated Margaret Collins. I watched you be rude to her for years. You acted like she was invisible or like she was somehow less important than you because she worked for me. Maggie shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She didn't like being the center of attention, even in a letter. The lawyer continued with Harold's words. I have recordings of Richard calling Margaret just the help, and Linda laughing when Margaret accidentally broke a dish. I heard Patricia tell her husband that Margaret was getting ideas above her station when she offered to help me organize my medications. Stephen looked down at his hands, remembering that conversation. He had agreed with his wife at the time, but now he felt ashamed. I also recorded the family dinner last Thanksgiving, Mr. Peterson read. Margaret worked all day to prepare a beautiful meal for all of us. She served everyone with a smile, even though Richard complained that the turkey was too dry and Patricia said the potatoes needed more salt. Not one person thanked her for her hard work. When she dropped a fork while clearing the table, Carl made a joke about clumsy servants. The room was completely quiet now. Everyone was remembering that Thanksgiving dinner. At the time, their treatment of Maggie had seemed normal to them. But hearing it described in Harold's letter made them realize how cruel they had been. Stir. Peterson turned to another page. Margaret never asked me for anything extra. When I gave her a Christmas bonus, she tried to give it back, saying her regular salary was enough. When I bought her a warm coat because I noticed her old one was worn out, she cried and said it was too expensive. She cared more about my feelings than my money. The lawyer looked up at Maggie before continuing. Harold wrote about specific examples of your kindness, Mrs. Collins. He remembered when you stayed late to take care of him when he had pneumonia. He wrote about how you listened to his stories about your mother, even though he told the same stories over and over. He mentioned that you never seemed bored or impatient with him. Maggie wiped away a tear. She remembered all those times. She had stayed late not because she had to, but because Mr. Harold seemed so lonely and scared when he was sick. The letter continued with more examples. Harold wrote about Maggie reading to him when his eyes got tired. He described how she always remembered his favorite foods and made sure to cook them when he seemed sad. He wrote about the way she cleaned his wife's pictures with extra care, and how she never moved the items on his wife's dresser because she knew they were exactly where he wanted them. Margaret treated my memories of Helen with respect, Mr. Peterson read. She understood that some things were too precious to change. My family always wanted me to pack away Helen's belongings and move on, but Margaret knew that keeping those things nearby brought me comfort. Frank spoke quietly. We thought it would be healthier for him to let go of the past. The lawyer read Harold's response to that idea. My family thought they knew what was best for me, but they never asked what I wanted. Margaret asked. She listened to my answers. She understood that Helen's memory was part of what kept me happy. The letter went on to describe the difference between duty and love. Harold wrote that his family visited him out of duty or when they needed something, but Maggie took care of him out of genuine affection. She worried about him when he seemed sad. She celebrated with him when he had good news. She treated him like a friend, not just an employer. I know my family will say that Margaret manipulated me or tricked me somehow, Mr. Peterson read, but the truth is exactly the opposite. Margaret tried to talk me out of changing my will. When I told her I was thinking about leaving her something special, she said I should give everything to my children because they were my real family. Richard looked shocked. She said that? The lawyer nodded and continued reading. Margaret's reaction proved to me that she deserved my trust. Someone who was trying to steal my money would have encouraged me to change my will. Instead, she tried to protect my family's interests, even though they had never been kind to her. Harold's letter explained that he had tested everyone over the past year. He had pretended to be more confused and helpless than he really was, just to see how people would treat him. His family had become impatient with his slowness and frustrated with his questions. But Maggie had remained patient and gentle, never making him feel stupid or burdensome. I am giving my fortune to Margaret because she earned it through kindness, the lawyer read. She made my final years happy and comfortable. She treated me with dignity when others treated me like a burden. She deserves to be rewarded for her good heart. The letter ended with Harold's final message to his family. I hope that someday you will understand that love cannot be bought or inherited. It must be earned through actions, not words. Margaret earned my love and trust. I wish all of you had done the same. Mr. Peterson folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. The room was silent, except for the sound of Linda's quiet crying. Everyone was thinking about Harold's words and remembering their own behavior over the past few years. Mr. Peterson spread several official documents across the table. Each paper had official seals and signatures that made them look very important and legal. The family members stared at the papers with growing worry as they realized Harold had planned everything down to the smallest detail. Your father hired 3 different law firms to make sure his will could not be challenged, the lawyer explained. He also had 2 psychiatric evaluations done by doctors who didn't know each other. Both doctors confirmed that Harold was completely mentally healthy when he made his final decisions. Richard grabbed one of the papers and tried to read it, but the legal language was too complicated for him to understand. There has to be something wrong with these documents. Old people get confused. They make bad decisions. Mr. Peterson shook his head. The psychiatric reports show that your father scored perfectly on all mental health tests. His memory was sharp. His reasoning was clear, and he understood exactly what he was doing. One doctor even noted that Harold seemed more mentally alert than most people half his age. Patricia was still crying, but now her tears were angry. I don't care what any doctor says. No sane father would give away $12 million to a servant. There has to be a way to fix this. The lawyer pulled out another folder. Harold also made video recordings explaining his decisions. He recorded these videos over several months, showing that his feelings were consistent over time. In the videos, he explains his reasons clearly and calmly. He never seems confused or pressured by anyone. Frank spoke up for the first time in several minutes. Can we see these videos? Mr. Peterson nodded and turned on a small television in the corner of the room. Harold's face appeared on the screen, sitting in his favorite chair in the living room. He looked directly at the camera and spoke in a clear, strong voice. My name is Harold James Whitman, and today is March 15th. I am making this recording to explain why I am leaving my fortune to Margaret Collins instead of to my family. Seeing their father alive again made several family members start crying, but Harold's next words made them stop. I want to be very clear that no one is forcing me to make this decision. Margaret doesn't even know I'm making these recordings. In fact, she has tried several times to convince me to leave everything to my children. Her protests only prove that she deserves my trust. On the screen, Harold held up a notebook. I have been keeping detailed records of every conversation I have with my family and with Margaret. I write down what people say to me and how they treat me. The differences are shocking. Harold opened the notebook and read from it. Yesterday, Richard called me. He talked for 15 minutes about his money problems, but didn't ask once about my health. When I tried to tell him about my doctor's appointment, he said he had to go because he was busy. The real Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. As he watched his father on the screen, Harold continued reading. The same day, Margaret noticed I seemed tired. She made me tea and asked if I wanted to talk about what was bothering me. When I told her about my doctor's appointment, she listened carefully and asked if I needed her to drive me there. She didn't have to do this. It wasn't part of her job. She did it because she cared. The video showed Harold turning to a new page in his notebook. Last week, Patricia visited me. She spent most of the time showing me pictures of expensive jewelry she wanted to buy. When I said I wasn't feeling well, she said, "That's too bad," and kept talking about shopping. She left after 30 minutes. Patricia watched herself being described and felt ashamed. She remembered that visit, and she remembered being more interested in the jewelry than in her father's health. Harold's voice on the video became sadder. Margaret has never asked me to buy her anything. When I gave her a small gift for her birthday, she cried and said it was too much. She tried to give it back to me. What kind of person tries to give back a gift? Only someone who isn't greedy. The family watched several more minutes of Harold explaining his decision. In every video, he seemed calm and sure of himself. He never appeared confused or manipulated. He spoke like a man who had thought very carefully about his choices. When the videos ended, Mr. Peterson turned off the television. As you can see, your father was completely aware of what he was doing. He documented everything carefully because he knew you would try to fight his decision. Carl was the first to speak. Even if Dad was thinking clearly, this still isn't fair. We're his family. Blood should count for something. The lawyer pulled out one final document. Actually, Harold addressed that concern too. He wrote a statement about family obligations and what children should expect from their parents. Mr. Peterson read Harold's words. I gave my children life, food, shelter, education, and love for many years. I paid for Richard's college and his first business. I paid for Patricia's wedding and helped her buy her first house. I gave them both more money and opportunities than most parents ever could. I don't owe them anything more. The statement continued. Children are not entitled to their parents' money just because they were born. Inheritance should be earned through love, respect, and kindness. My family failed to earn my trust, but Margaret succeeded. Linda spoke through her tears. But what are we supposed to do now? Richard's business is failing. We were counting on this inheritance. Mr. Peterson looked at her seriously. That's exactly the problem Harold was talking about. You made plans based on money that didn't belong to you yet. You treated his fortune like it was already yours instead of being grateful for what he had already given you. Over the following weeks, the family hired their own lawyers to try to challenge the will, but every legal expert they consulted told them the same thing. Harold's will was perfect. The psychiatric evaluations were thorough. The video recordings were clear. The written documentation was complete. There was no way to prove that Harold wasn't capable of making his own decisions. Richard's lawyer was honest with him. Your father was smarter than you gave him credit for. He knew exactly what you would try to do, and he prepared for every possible challenge. You can spend thousands of dollars fighting this, but you won't win. Patricia tried a different approach. She went to Maggie's small apartment and begged her to share the inheritance. Please, Margaret, we're family. We grew up in that house. Some of that money should be ours. Maggie listened politely but shook her head. Your father made his choice, for his own reasons. I can't change what he decided. I'm sorry you're upset, but this isn't my fault. Patricia's politeness disappeared quickly. You manipulated him. You made him turn against his own children. You're nothing but a greedy old woman who stole our inheritance. Maggie remained calm, despite Patricia's harsh words. I understand you're angry, but I never asked your father for anything. I tried to convince him to leave everything to his family. If you want to blame someone, blame yourselves for how you treated him. After several months of failed legal challenges, the family had to accept reality. The inheritance belonged to Maggie, and there was nothing they could do about it. Their lawyers' fees had cost them thousands of dollars they couldn't afford to lose. Maggie found herself overwhelmed by her new responsibilities. She met with financial advisors and business managers to understand Harold's construction company and investments. She discovered that Harold had been preparing her for this role without her realizing it. All those times he had asked for her opinion about business decisions hadn't been casual conversation. He had been teaching her about his companies. She decided to keep Harold's businesses running rather than selling them. The construction company employed 50 people who depended on their jobs to support their families. Maggie felt responsible for taking care of them the same way she had taken care of Harold. But she also used Harold's wealth to help others. She started a scholarship program for students from poor families who wanted to go to college. She increased donations to the charities Harold had quietly supported for years. She helped several of Harold's employees who were struggling with medical bills or other financial problems. Maggie moved into Harold's house, not because she wanted to live in luxury, but because Harold had specifically asked her to take care of it. She kept his wife's garden beautiful and maintained the house exactly the way Harold would have wanted. The family members who had mocked her now faced their own financial struggles. Richard's business failed completely when he couldn't get any more loans. Patricia had to sell her expensive jewelry to pay her bills. They learned too late that their father's love and money had been connected to their behavior toward him. A year after Harold's death, Maggie visited his grave every Sunday, after church. She brought fresh flowers and told him about the people his money was helping. She thanked him for trusting her with his fortune and promised to use it wisely. Standing at Harold's grave, Maggie thought about how much her life had changed. She was no longer a simple housekeeper living in a small apartment. She was now responsible for millions of dollars and dozens of employees. But she was still the same person inside. She still believed in treating people with kindness and respect. Harold had seen something special in her when his own family couldn't. He had looked past her plain clothes and simple manner to see her good heart. His final gift wasn't just money.